Hello, everybody. Happy St. Patrick's Day. It's Tuesday today, St. Patrick's Day. Second day of our national lockdown. And a good day to read more of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So if you have a copy of Romeo and Juliet, you can read along with me. We got up through Act 1, Scene 1 yesterday. And thought we'd go ahead and read Act 1, Scene 2 today. And I brought up yesterday the idea of reading the play a number of different ways. Frequently it's read as a great romance, this misunderstood lovers whose families keep them apart, blah, 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 blah. Teenage angst and all that. And I don't like to read it that way. Probably because I think that's too simplistic a way of reading it, but also because it's far more intriguing to read it either as ungoverned lust that Shakespeare is condemning here, as he does in his Sonnet 129, which I'll have to find that and read that in full, I think. Maybe I'll read that tomorrow. That'd be a good idea, Sonnet 129. I'll make a note of that. But that's one way of looking at it as sort of this is a tragedy. I mean, it even says the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. This is a tragedy of what happens when two people don't govern themselves, don't control themselves. Let's see, I'll look at that tomorrow. Possibility to share with everybody, Sonnet 129. I think the other one is Sonnet 145, if I'm not mistaken, but I'll look it up and see. Find out what I can. Another way of looking at this poem, or this play, is as an embodiment of a philosophical idea. Frequently with great art, you have some philosophical idea or premise that the artist is working through their own idea that they keep coming back to. And you see this a lot with modern poets and playwrights and directors. So for instance, like Francis Ford Coppola, who was the great director of The Godfather and other movies, was always working through, I think, the idea of human evil. What is the attraction of evil? The whole Godfather series, for instance, is about the attraction of evil to Michael Corleone. Or you see it in modern great directors of the modern era right now, like Denis Villeneuve. Denis Villeneuve has an ongoing theme in his movies about the nature of what it means to be human and the nature of our own freedom and personal responsibility. It comes up in movie after movie by Villeneuve. Or you might see it in Christopher Nolan's movies, Interstellar, for instance, or Inception, or the Batman movies. Or his Dunkirk, a very misunderstood movie, I think. But Christopher Nolan is frequently examining the idea of what does it to mean to be trapped? What does it mean to be imprisoned? And how do we escape from that prison? Do we do it by our actions, or do we do it by simply being interiorly good people? The great line in Batman when Batman says, it's not who I am inside, but what I do that defines me. And I think that idea for Nolan is an ongoing theme. The idea is that what you do defines you, not what you are interiorly. So anyway, the point being that artists frequently have an ongoing idea that they work out in the course of their works, their oeuvre, their corpus of text. And I think Shakespeare was no different. Certainly his plays can be read in multiple levels. There's the different things that you can glean from the work. But one of the ongoing problems, he had several ongoing problems. He was dealing with the idea of power and how do you maintain power and still remain a good person. Or the idea of gender identity, I think, was a big thing for him. Or I think the idea of how does a person gain real love in a world that is filled with duplicity. But I think one of the philosophical problems that he was definitely working through was this idea of the scholastic debate. And I touched a little bit about that last time, And I thought I'd throw out one or two big words here to season the pot, so to speak. In studying the scholastic debate, we have to recognize that it emerges from as Joseph Pieper points out in his book Scholasticism, it emerges from a sort of dark era of literature and philosophy. It's a recovery, basically, from a dark era of philosophy and culture. After the collapse of the Roman Empire and all the systems that were associated with the Roman Empire, you had European culture was kind of on the skids, and a lot of that culture had transferred over to Byzantium and the Byzantine church, which maintained it, but maintained it under siege because they were besieged after the rise of Islam. They were besieged by the Mohammedans, the Muslims who were constantly in warfare with Byzantium. So Byzantium was certainly a center of learning, but it was under siege for many years, up until 1453, when it fell to the Sultan. The Muslims, on the other hand, had also gained a great deal of culture and philosophy and literature from their conquests and from their trade, and so they had created a whole culture as well. Here comes Andrew. He's wandering in. So hi, Andrew.
Hi, Dad.
Hi. Okay. The Muslims had gained much of their culture and their literature from the conquests that they made, including the conquest of these major libraries there in India that they had conquered. And they had therefore gained all this knowledge that then they cultivated in what's called the School of Baghdad. And that School of Baghdad had risen to prominence until the 1300s. And there they were responsible for naming all the stars. They did a great deal of astronomy. They were responsible for advances in medicine and advances in science and advances in architecture. They also had taken a great many of the works of Greek and also some Roman, but mostly Greek works, and had translated them into Arabic. So, for instance, Euclid's Elements had been translated and commented on, and Aristotle's works had been translated and commented on. And those translated texts have been passed through the Muslim Empire in Northern Africa and had come around again to Spain until they were translated into Latin again in Spain. So the major texts of Aristotle had kind of been lost to Western culture after a certain period of time, and Western culture had developed with Platonic ideas, the works of Plato, which the actual works themselves were not all available, but the ideas of Plato were so ubiquitous that they had permeated into the very culture. And our sense of philosophy and our sense of religion, Christianity itself, was predominantly a Platonic-based way of looking at the world. So Aristotle's works coming back into our culture, the Western culture, roughly around the 1100s, the 1000s, 1100s, that began a sort of intellectual revolution that then generated into the scholastic debate. Now, why would that be the case? Well, Plato was struggling already with the problem of universals versus particulars. And this problem of universals versus particulars goes way back. I don't need to go into a ton of detail here with it, but the idea being that if you have a particular thing, it shares with other particular things certain qualities that make it more universal. So say, for instance, we're dealing with socks, okay, footwear. What makes wool socks, and also makes white athletic socks, and what makes striped socks, as well as pink socks, or do nylons constitute socks? All those different particular things share a quality that makes them sockness. And how then those things share in sockness relates to how they share in existence itself, well, clothing first, and then artifice, and then existence itself. And existence itself shares in being, the very quality of being qua being. So in a philosophical structural pattern, where everything that exists around us has this quality to it that makes it a particular thing, and then it might share with other things similar to it qualities that make it more universal. And how those particulars relate to those universals was sort of the problem of philosophy as far back as Plato and Aristotle. Plato suggested that those particulars related to the universals in what he called the great chain of being, that being itself emanates from the good, the ton kolon, and the good itself, God, was a being that was the source of all that exists, the source of being itself. From that then emanated this pattern called the Logos, and that pattern created these universal shapes or forms. Plato called them eidoi in Greek. And those eidoi then govern how each particular body of things then emerged into or emanated into the physical world around us. That meant that everything was governed by a single pattern, order, and structure that was residing in the mind of God. And our Western culture developed around that very concept. Our very religion developed around that concept. Imagine then in this worldview, you suddenly get these massive works being reintroduced, Aristotle's works, ethics, for instance, Nicomachean Ethics, and the metaphysics, and they're reintroduced, and they not only have a very well thought out worldview that has nothing to do with Christianity, because they're pagan works, but also a worldview that is based not on the universals to the particulars, but the particulars to the universals. So Aristotle, instead of looking at the Logos and saying all things emerge from the Logos, Aristotle said, look at all these particular things. And what can we derive from the pattern that these particular things set up, and abstract and abstract and abstract to higher and higher levels? So you see how that works. Plato said, here is the universal, and we descend down into particulars. Aristotle said, here are the particulars, and we extract from them until we get these universal concepts. When those works of Aristotle were reintroduced into Europe, they hit kind of like a thunderclap. Joseph Pieper points this out in his book of scholasticism, says they hit like a thunderbolt. But they were very useful and very helpful for a lot of the thinkers who were involved in the scholastic world. Scholasticism had itself emerged from the scriptoria of Charlemagne in the 800s and 900s. And Charlemagne had commissioned all these people to get together in a building, and by daylight or candlelight, sit and copy the works that they knew existed already, because they knew they had to preserve them for future generations. So those works of the scriptoria then were just the copying down of stuff, scribes copying down of stuff. And as time went on, the various men that copied these things down and studied them began collecting them together, and they put them together in what are called sententiae, the various ideas or thoughts of generations that came from the past. Those sententiae then would be collected together in what are called summae, a summary, a collection of ideas. And as time went on, people began to notice that this fellow over here with his sententiae contradicted this fellow over here with his sententiae. Both couldn't be correct. And so they began saying, well, where do we find common ground between these ideas? What is the right way of thinking? How do we deal with the fact that great men here contradict great men here? And by putting those things together, they began to generate this dialectic reasoning, where they look at this and then they look at that and they say, but this must be the truth. And that's what we see in great works like by Thomas Aquinas in the Summa. And as they did this thing called disputation, they came to realize that there was a major discrepancy between Plato and Aristotle's thought. And Plato's thought suggested there were these universals that emanated from the mind of God, and Aristotle suggested that these universals were mere abstractions by human beings in order to survive in the world. And you had a character by the name of William of Ockham, who suggested that those universals are mere psychological constructs. They're psychological labels. Well, that's problematic because that challenges the entire worldview and the entire theological view of Western culture. So you had two groups in this, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. The Franciscans were those that were suggesting that that faith seeks understanding, that we get essentially from the faith in God and that structure of the logos, that structure of the pattern, we seek to understand how all those things fit into the pattern. The Dominicans, on the other hand, emphasized human thought and human logic, and were very keen on the idea that these universal patterns emerged from the abstraction of the particulars that are around us. This becomes important later on in our play, by the way, because we get a character who is of those orders, and he definitely exhibits the qualities of the novelist and realists. So, lastly, and this is long-winded. I'm sorry, but that's my nature, is to be long-winded. Lastly, is that when we're dealing with these particulars, they had a word that they used, which was the haexiety of a thing. The haexiety of a thing, you can imagine, is the thisness of the thing, this particular sock, if you go back to the example I used earlier. Haexiety meant that we're dealing not with a universal sockness or tree-ness or humanness, but with this sock and this tree and this man. Haexiety was set up as opposed to or in relationship to what was called quiddity. And quiddity is the essence of the thing. It's the universal sockness of the sock, or the universal treeness of the tree, or the universal manness of the man. And this, you might have heard the problem of if you take a sock and you patch a hole in the sock with another piece of cloth, and then you patch another hole and so on and so forth. At what point, when you have the whole, the original cloth of the sock is gone and all you have is the patches, at what point does that sock stop being that particular sock? That's, I think that's called Jason's ship or something. It's an ancient world problem. And it doesn't seem like a big deal when we're talking about socks, but it is a big deal when it's talking about human beings, for instance, because if, as a man or a woman, over time, your physical body is replaced, all the cells are replaced, and over time you change, you grow older. At what point do you stop being the same person you were before? At what point does the essence change? Or for that matter, what is the essence that makes the you? Well, this issue then came to this head between characters like, say, Anselm of Canterbury and Thomas Aquinas. Anselm of Canterbury, who was a huge figure in the scholastic debate, came up with what's called the ontological proof of God. He talked about how the existence of God must be self-evident, he says, because God has to be that which then nothing greater can be conceived. So for Anselm of Canterbury, his idea was that when we conceive of everything, we conceive of something greater than that and greater than that. And when we get to a point where there's something that you can't conceive anything greater, well, that must be God. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about God. And it's self-evident because the minute that you conceive of something greater than this thing, well, then that thing must be God, not the previous. And it's self-evident because at some point you must come to a thing which can't be any greater than what you conceived before. And that's, for Anselm, that's obvious that exists. And only a fool, Anselm says, only a fool would then deny that because it's so self-evident that you have to be stubborn, you have to be a fool to deny it. Thomas Aquinas weighed in on that, and he said that actually there are two types of self-evident. That there's self-evident in and of itself, and there's self-evident to the observer. So self-evident in and of itself, Thomas Aquinas says, like a triangle is an object with three angles, three sides or three angles. Well, that's where the definition is contained within the word itself. Triangle means an object with three angles to it. Triangle. And so it's self-evident that a triangle would have three angles, because that's the very definition of triangle. But then it's not evident to the observer, who may not recognize the thing or may not be able to accept the thing or may not be able to make the leap to accept that this has connection to something else. Thomas Aquinas says the very problem of accepting God and the existence of God is that it requires a certain acceptance that there's a system that emanates from a central being, the Logos. And if we don't accept that, we're not foolish. That's the thing that we cannot get over, Thomas Aquinas says. And therefore we're not foolish in this. It's that it's not self-evident to us. There's a leap of faith or a movement of faith that has to occur before we ever accept any of that business. Now, why would any of this be at all important in Shakespeare's time? Because Shakespeare, of course, is writing Romeo and Juliet in the 1590s, which there's a lot of water under the bridge between the 1200s and the 1600s. We're talking 300 years here, that might have changed. Well, there's a lot of history there which I can go over at a future date, but the concept itself of that shift between the Platonic and the Aristotelian worldview, I think, was still very, very prominent. It didn't go away easily. It did. I think it was very threatened and almost went away in the minds of many people because of certain events that occurred between the 13th century and the 1500s, the 16th century. And I think that Shakespeare was wrestling with that issue. It didn't just vanish with Archbishop Tempier shutting down the debate. And so Shakespeare, it seems to me, is bringing up this problem of universals and particulars, of the individual versus the universal, of seeking for what is at the heart of our existence in the character of Romeo himself. And I think to some degree he's embodying a certain attitude or a certain reaction that the nominalists probably had, Shakespeare seems to suggest, and he's doing so in the person of Juliet. Juliet ends up being a character whose motivations are bitter, I think, and are bitter in the same way that the nominalists seem to William Shakespeare seem to be bitter as well. Hopefully that's clear. If it isn't clear, please leave me a note and ask about things. I'd love to hear from people here and see what you had to think on this. For our sake, let's go ahead and we'll do a little bit of reading of Romeo and Juliet and just probe a little bit into what Shakespeare has to say here. Now this is Act 1, Scene 2. And in Act 1, Scene 1, we've got the introduction of the character of Romeo, and he's a brooding kid, a young man, who is kind of an emo. He's kind of a goth, and he's always troubled over the nature of human existence and troubled over the violence that we keep falling into, and he's pining for something to fill up this emptiness inside him, and he thinks it's going to be romance, love for a girl, namely Rosalind, who is the cousin of Juliet. But Rosalind has remained chaste to him, and Rosalind, who is sort of the mystical rose, remains aloof, chaste, doesn't really consummate the relationship at all. And here we have Scene 2. This is Act 1, Scene 2. And in this scene we have Lord Capulet dealing with Paris. And we're going to find out a little bit more about some of the background here for Juliet. Act 1, Scene 2, Romeo and Juliet by William Shakespeare. Enter Capulet, Paris, and servant. Capulet begins. But Montague is bound as well as I in penalty alike, and 'tis not hard, I think, for men so old as we to keep the peace. Paris responds, Of honourable reckoning are you both, and pity 'tis you lived at odds so long. But now, my lord, what say you to my suit? But saying o'er what I have said before, my child is yet a stranger in the world. She hath not seen the change of 14 years. Let 2 more summers wither in their pride, ere we think her ripe to be a bride. Younger than she our happy mother's maid. And too soon marred are those so early made. The earth hath swallowed all my hopes but she. She is the hopeful lady of my earth. But woo her, gentle Paris, get her heart. My will to her consent is but a part. And she agree, within her scope of choice lies my consent, and fair according voice. This night I hold an old accustomed feast, whereto I have invited many a guest, such as I love, and you among the store. One more, most welcome, makes my number more. At my poor house look to behold this night earth-treading stars that make dark heaven light. Such comfort as do lusty young men feel when well-apparelled April on the heel of limping winter treads. Even such delight among fresh female buds shall you this night inherit at my house. Hear all see, and like her most, whose merit most shall be, which on more view of many mine be one, may stand in number, though in reckoning none. Come, go with me. Go, sirrah, trudge about through fair Verona, and find those persons out whose names are written here, and to them say, my house, and welcome on their pleasure stay. Exeunt Capulet and Paris. And the servant. Find them out whose names are written here. It's written that the shoemaker should meddle with his yard, and the tailor with his last, the fisher with his pencil, and the painter with his net. But I am sent to find those persons whose names are here writ. I can never find what names the writing person hath here writ. I must to the learned in good time. Enter Benvolio and Romeo. Tut, man, one fire burns out another's burning, one pain is lessened by another's anguish. Turn giddy, and be hope by backward turning. One desperate grief cures with another's languish. Take thou some new infection to thy eye, and the rank poison of the old will die. Romeo responds, Your plantain leaf is excellent for that. For what, I pray thee? For your broken shin. Why, Romeo, art thou mad? Not mad, but bound more than a madman is. Shut up in prison, kept without my food, whipped and tormented, and... Got in, good fellow. Got in, I pray, sir, can you read? Aye, mine own fortune and my misery. Perhaps you've learned it without book, but I pray, can you read anything you see? Aye, if I know the letters and the language. You say honestly, rest you merry. Stay, fellow, I can read. And he reads the letter. Signor Martino and his wife and daughters, County Anselm and his beauteous sisters, the lady widow of Vitruvio, Signor Placencio and his lovely nieces, Mercutio and his brother Valentine, mine uncle Capulet, his wife and daughters, my fair niece Rosaline, Livia, Signor Valencio and his cousin Tybalt, Lucio and the lively Helena. A fair assembly. Whither should they come? Up. Whither, to supper? To our house. Whose house? My master's. Indeed, I should have asked you that before. Now, I'll tell you without asking. My master's the great rich Capulet, and if you be not to the house of Montagues, I pray come and crush a cup of wine. Rest you merry. He exits. At this same ancient feast of Capulets sups the fair Rosaline whom thou so lovest, with all the admired beauties of Verona. Go thither, and with unattainted eye compare her face with some that I shall show, and I will make thee think thy swan a crow. When the devout religion of mine eye maintains such falsehood, then turn tears to fires, and these, who often drowned, could never die, transparent heretics be burnt for liars. One fairer than my love, the all-seeing sun ne'er saw her match since first the world begun. Tut, you saw her fair, none else being by, herself poised with herself in either eye. But in that crystal scales let there be weighed your lady's love against some other maid, that I will show you shining at this feast, and she shall scant show well that now seems best. I'll go alone, no such sight to be shown, but to rejoice in splendor of mine own. Exeunt. And that's the end of scene 2. There's a lot to glean from this as well. Shakespeare's always very cagey in releasing information. And if we go back for a little bit here, the first thing I wanted to point out is that in the exchange between Capulet and Paris, Capulet doesn't want his daughter to be married because, on the one hand, she's too young. Notice he says, she hath not seen the change of 14 years. Now that implies to us that Juliet is 13 years old. You've got to get your head around that in the modern era. This is not, she's not in her 20s or something. She is a very young girl, just on the verge of womanhood, you know, and 13 years old. She's not going to be somebody who is seen a lot of the world or is very reliable or somebody who we would say is ready to make a family. And that's what Capulet says. She's not ready to make a family. Why? Because we get indication elsewhere that Capulet has lost a wife because she's been marred basically by early childbirth, and that Capulet is very scared that his daughter is going to die in childbirth at such a young age. And he suggests that she is the last of his hopes, right? The earth hath swallowed all my hopes but she. In other words, Capulet has had other children before her, and they've all died. And it is suggested that his current wife is his second wife at least, because his earlier wife had died. So there's a bit of background there going on. And he urges Paris, don't rush this. Don't rush into a marriage with my daughter. Woo her, right? Get her love, but don't rush into a marriage with her. The second reason he doesn't want his Juliet to be married so young is because he wants Juliet to have consent when she marries. And I find that kind of startling. What kind of father would it be in this era, especially of arranged marriages? What kind of father is it that would want his daughter to fall in love with and agree to the marriage that her father arranges? That seems to strike me as a very generous father, a very doting father, a father who is very concerned with his daughter's happiness. So we can take that away, that Capulet he's concerned with his daughter and her health and her consent and her free will. We also notice here that he's going to be hosting a party, and he invites Paris to come and look at all the girls at the party, you know, and see whether there are others that he might agree to. And the party is being held in an era where it says, limping winter treads, even such delight among fresh female buds shall you this night inherit at my house. So the party is being held during a time when April, on the heel of limping winter treads. What does that indicate the time of year to be? Seems that it would indicate that this play is set during springtime. And if we look at it at April, right, on the heel of limping winter treads, what major celebration occurs roughly around April? Roughly around that time is the equinox, right, where the days and nights are equal, and also roughly around that time is Easter, the celebration of Easter. That seems to be something intentional on the part of Shakespeare, because we find out, not to give away too much of the plot, but we find out that the romance between Romeo and Juliet lasts for 3 days. and then the end of the play comes. So 3 days for Romeo and Juliet, 3 days in the tomb and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Is there a coordination between the two? It seems almost like Shakespeare's setting up a parallel between the two, even from the very start here. Notice also that Capulet is very concerned also with what type of man Paris is. And if we look at what kind of guy he is, Paris, in the few lines that we have, seems to be rational. He seems to be intelligent. He seems to be a man who is acceptable in every way as a husband and as a father. He is a little bit older. I would probably put him in his 20s because he seems to be responsible in what he's doing. But he is a man who's he's ready for a family. He's not somebody who's an ancient man looking for a young bride, but he's also not a young man who's impetuous. Well, so much for that. The servant then can't understand anything on the list that he's given to invite people to the party because he can't read. And so by accident, by fortune, by providence, what have you, he bumps into Benvolio and Romeo, who are carrying over this debate from the previous act about whether or not Romeo, who has put all of his desire into Rosalind, is doing the right thing. And Benvolio says, no, you aren't. You need to see other girls to compare your girls, these other girls, to your girl of Rosalind. And once you do so, you'll find that there are plenty of fish in the sea, so to speak. But do notice how Romeo responds in a couple lines here, because I think it's intriguing how similar the character of Romeo is to that other character in Shakespeare's work of Hamlet. He says here at one point, Benvolio says, why, Romeo, art thou mad? And Romeo says, I'm not mad, but bound more than a madman is, shut up in prison, kept without my food, whipped and tormented. And then he breaks off because he sees the servant. That is strikingly similar to what Hamlet says. I would be bound in the space of a nutshell and consider myself the king of infinite space were it not that I have had bad dreams. Or he says to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, what brings you to prison? Because Denmark is a prison, he says. Or at another point, Hamlet says, what is this celestial fire? This firmament above us fretted with celestial fire. 'Tis but to me a pestilential congregation of vapors, right? That the world doesn't delight Hamlet anymore. It seems almost like a prison house to him. That's very similar to what Romeo seems to be going through. So we can go back to the idea, to some degree, that the character of Hamlet is somewhat embodied in the person of Romeo in this text here. And then there's a little bit of humor between the servant and Romeo, that Romeo can certainly read words if he knows the letters and the language. Notice that it is a slight jab at the idea of words related to meaning. That if I can read the words, then I can know what I'm talking about. Not a huge intriguing portion of the scholastic debate, but certainly reference to the scholastic debate. And in the reading of the letter, Romeo reads all the names until he comes across the name of Rosalind, and that stops him short. And that's what convinces him to go to this party. He says then at the very end, Benvolio says, you're going to see a lot of girls there. And Romeo says, none are going to be like my gal, right? These who often drown could never die. Transparent heretics be burnt for liars. One fairer than my love. The all-seeing sun ne'er saw her match since first the world begun. So this Romeo says, the sun shines on my lady, and nobody can compare to her. She's just this nonpareil of beauty. But he is not really sure that he wants to go to the party to see other girls. Maybe to see Rosalind, but not to see other girls. And it says, I'll go along, right, to rejoice in splendor of mine own, to rejoice in the splendor of my girl, of Rosalind. But that's all I want to see, just Rosalind, nobody else. So that ends scene 2, Act 1, scene 2. And I think that's quite sufficient for today. We'll pick up again tomorrow and read the next scene. Now, thank you all for joining me. I'm just beginning to lose my voice again, so maybe now's a good time to bow out. If you had questions or observations, feel free to type them in. I'd be glad to answer and continue the conversation. God bless you all and keep you safe. And we'll see you again tomorrow.